Hello, and welcome to the Arizona Pilots Association's presentation on soft field operations. This presentation is part of a series of programs intended to both enhance aviation safety and promote general aviation activities. For most of us, our training in soft field operations probably occurred in our primary trainer and was conducted on asphalt. As a result, most of us get a little nervous about actually putting some of our soft field knowledge into practice, and the purpose of this particular presentation is to show that those basics that you learned so long ago are perfectly valid in both a high-performance aircraft and in the real world. As a side note, please know that this presentation was put together by pilots for pilots. Although most of the folks doing this work happen to be flight instructors, we aren't a professional AV crew, and you're going to hear ands and uhs and a few stumbles. But the information is basically good, and we believe that you'll have a good time. So without any further ado, let's get started. Here's a brief outline of the topics that we'll cover today. I don't need to spend much time on this. I'll give you a little bit of quick background on both myself and the aircraft that we'll be using. Then we'll make some general observations about the kinds of surfaces we'll be landing on and taking off from, and then we'll get into some details about those landing and takeoff procedures. Then later on we'll talk a little bit about the after effects of landing on dirt and grass and so on. And then to whet your appetite, there'll be a few photos of some really neat places you can go once you leave the asphalt. Here's a little background on both myself as well as the aircraft. At that time I was flying frequently down into Mexico and up to Montana, and I had only about 2,700 hours at that time. Currently I've got over 5,000, and 857 Charlie Delta, my Cirrus, has over 2,300 hours on her. When you move from hard surfaces like asphalt or concrete onto softer surfaces like dirt or grass, there are a variety of new considerations to take into account. Take a glance down both of these columns, and most of them are fairly self-evident, but let's talk about the kinds of impact they have upon landing and takeoff operations. Let's review dirt first. Contrary to what you might initially think, most regularly used dirt runways are relatively well packed and fairly firm, and their surfaces are fairly smooth. On the other hand, dirt does provide additional drag, which affects both your landing and takeoff distances. Braking can be adequate, although it certainly won't be as good as it is on concrete or asphalt. And of particular concern are the rocks and pebbles and small clods of dirt that can abuse both your propeller and the wheel pans. For a dirt surface, the runway is entirely visible, and so it's quite possible to do a low approach and overfly the field and confirm its condition relatively easily. Now, for grass, that surface becomes softer. What happens is, of course, if the grass is to survive, the earth has to be a little bit damp, and that dampness makes the earth softer. And in addition, it will be usually rougher than a corresponding dirt runway. The grass also adds significant amount of drag, and again, that affects your landing and takeoff distance. Furthermore, when the grass is wet, the braking can be very poor, and the grass can hide things. Somebody can leave a length of pipe on the runway and you won't see it. There can be a large hole and you won't be able to see it from the air. You can have moles or other burrowing animals find their home in the middle of the runway and you won't see them either. Unlike an asphalt or concrete surface, rain can have a completely different effect on grass or dirt. On asphalt, admittedly, you're worried about hydroplaning, but our modern runways are designed so that that's less of a concern. On a dirt runway, unless it's extremely well drained, the runway can become a muddy mess, and frankly, it will make a mess out of your airplane. It'll clog up your brakes. Unless you happen to know that a dirt runway has excellent drainage, and perhaps you've had a local report that the runway is in good condition, you might be better off avoiding landing or taking off from dirt until after you're sure that it's dried out adequately. Rain on a grass runway affects the braking as mentioned earlier, and on top of that you can have some ponding possibly in the swales that is invisible to a flyover because it's simply hidden by the grass itself. So while you may be able to operate from a grass runway in the sense that it won't be muddy, you may have other concerns like ponding or simply very, very poor braking. Landing on a dirt or grass strip involves the same kind of preparation that landing on a conventional hard surface runway does. That this preparation may be more difficult because you won't have the usual sources of information available that are published by the FAA. But things to check. For pre-flight preparation, you want to make sure the runway is long enough. Verify the length using local means, walk it off if necessary, but make sure that you've got enough room to land and take off. Secondly, what's that condition of that runway? Is it full of chuck holes? When was the last time an airplane landed there? If it's grass, is the grass so long that it could likely hide things from you that you wouldn't see? What's the elevation of the airport? Are you going to have any density altitude issues upon takeoff? What's the surrounding terrain like? If you have to do a go-around, which way are you going to turn? Surveyed airports in the U.S. under the auspices of the FAA don't have obstacles that prevent you from doing a safe go-around. However, unimproved grass or dirt strips that may be out in the middle of nowhere, perhaps on some private property, don't have any such assurances. So you want to make sure that you have a back door. Lastly, you may even want to refer to that famous book that usually resides somewhere in the airplane called the Pilot Operating Handbook. It has guidelines on what to do for unimproved strips. You might want to refer to them. Now, after doing all your pre-flight preparation on the ground, you're actually finally in the air, approaching the landing strip, and gee whiz, there's no ATIS. There's no AWAS. In fact, you may not even know which way the wind is blowing. So how do you figure out which way to land? Well, that's not really all that difficult. First of all, many unimproved strips have a windsock, so do a low pass and see if you can locate the windsock. Look for flags in the area. You might be able to see tree leaves and see which way they're blowing. If there's water, you can often see ripples, and that will be an indicator of wind. If there are smokestacks or anything generating smoke in the area, that is, of course, a very easy indicator. And likewise, if there are farmers plowing fields or maybe there's a gravel road nearby, there may be dust being kicked up. At any rate, figure out which way the wind is blowing and land into the wind. For an altimeter setting, you really don't necessarily have anything to give you an accurate setting. However, close is probably good enough. So that means that if there is a nearby airport with either an ATIS or an AWAS that is at a similar elevation to this one, tune it in. Use their altimeter and you're probably all set. Now, if you're the first person to land on this runway in some time, you really don't know what its condition is. There could be animals on the runway. There could be foreign objects or debris, commonly called FOD. Maybe the runway surface has deteriorated since the last time it was used, or maybe even the runway is closed. Who knows? So if you're the first person there, it's not a bad idea to do a low pass. Basically, overfly the runway, put it off your side. You're the pilot in command. You're the one that needs to see it. Put it off your side, terrain permitting, of course. Slow down and get down relatively low. Relatively low, maybe 500 feet. That's just a guesstimate. Put in a notch of flaps if that'll make you more comfortable. That'll give you a little bit more margin above stall at slow speeds. It won't do you any good to overfly the field at a high rate of speed. You won't be able to see anything. The objective here is to make sure the runway is clear to land and you're not going to hit anything after you've rounded out, touched down, and it's too late to fly. After you've done this, after you're sure that the runway is clear and you figured out which way the wind's blowing, and you may or may not have a current altimeter setting, try to fly a normal approach if the terrain permits it. Unless otherwise published, fly left traffic and fly the numbers for your aircraft. Basically, you're going to want to treat this like a normal landing So you want to fly the normal numbers for a normal landing for your aircraft. We'll talk about adding a little bit of, just a little bit of throttle just before touchdown. But basically, a soft field landing is a normal landing with a slightly cushioned descent at the end. Assuming that by short final you're in a very stable approach with full flaps, nicely controlled airspeed, what you want to do is to do your normal round out and flare. In the flare, you want to be able to hold that flare as long as possible without excessive float. And you want to reduce your rate of descent slightly, and there are two schools of thought to do that. One is to hold extra power, a slightly amount of extra power during the descent itself, and another is to add just a touch of throttle just before what you perceive as touchdown. I happen to favor the latter, but there's certainly nothing wrong with either approach. You basically touch down in a nose-high attitude at minimum airspeed, and you bring the power smoothly back to idle, and the yoke should be full aft. You basically hold the nose off as long as possible, and then as the aircraft slows, the nose will come down all by itself. You use minimum braking, and while you're taxiing on this slow surface, the yoke is full aft to try to keep as much weight off the nose wheel as possible. Next, let's look at a series of photos that hopefully illustrate what I've been talking about. Here you can see a small agricultural strip in rural Arizona. This is actually in the southern part of the Phoenix Valley. It's a small dirt strip. There's no ASOS. There's no AWOS. There is a windsock, but you can't see it from here. And the runway orientation is southwest to northeast. Now normally, if this was a paved strip, the process would be to overfly the field at 500 feet above pattern, find the windsock, and then descend appropriately and fly the proper traffic pattern and land. However, in this case, I need to verify the condition of the runway. Paved strips are monitored and maintained, but dirt strips or grass strips that are unimproved or even improved but nonetheless not maintained by a formal FAA certified organization may have issues that could cause damage upon landing. So hence, you need to overfly the field. So here what I'm going to do is to basically fly kind of a wide left downwind as if I was landing to the northeast. Now while I'm doing this, I'm going to be very carefully looking for other traffic, because if there was landing traffic and if the wind was the opposite direction, that traffic would be flying left traffic, but they'd be on the other side of the runway from here. That would be off the left-hand side looking at this current orientation. And we could conceivably meet midfield, and we obviously don't want to do that. So here's where situational awareness needs to be heightened, and I'm scanning for traffic as well as simply lining up for a simple left downwind. Okay, here we are taking a look at the runway. I've put it off the left-hand side, which is where I'm sitting, and I'm probably several hundred feet off the ground. In my Cirrus, I have 50% flaps in, which is one of two notches of flaps. And so I've got plenty of margin above stall, and I can fly slowly enough that I can spend my time somewhat leisurely checking out the runway. I'm looking for any objects that don't look like they're the same color as that runway. I'm also looking for ditches or holes or anything else that could interrupt an otherwise smooth arrival. The next slide shows typical downwind panel indications for my Cirrus. Apparently the wind is favoring landing to the northeast, and I throttled back to about 110 knots or so, and you can see I've got a slight nose up attitude because I've slowed down and I need a little more pitch up to maintain level flight. I'm flying about 1,000 feet AGL, and I'm in a very slight right turn. Apparently I've moved perhaps a little closer to the runway than I'd like, and I'm just moving slowly away from it. Here you can see that I'm turning left base, and I'm looking out the window in the direction of the turn, checking for traffic, as well as probably glancing out the front, making sure that there's nobody in front of me. I throttled back in my Cirrus probably to 10.5 inches of manifold pressure. The airspeed's probably decreased to about 100 knots, and I'm probably descending at about 500 feet a minute. I haven't added any flaps yet. There's a standardized procedure for Cirrus pilots, and I deviate from it slightly, and I'd be happy to discuss that offline with any Cirrus drivers out there. At this point, I'm on a stabilized left base. I've deployed first notch of flaps, which is a Cirrus, is 50%. The extra drag has slowed my airspeed down to about 90. I've got a nice stable descent of 500 feet a minute, and the wings are level. You can see by looking at the altimeter that I'm about 400 feet lower than I was when I started, which is kind of a standard number for a typical pattern. At this point, I'm really not looking at the panel, regardless of what you might anticipate from this slide. Rather, I'm looking outside the aircraft, looking for other planes, particularly since this is a uncontrolled, non-towered strip and perhaps in the middle of nowhere. You've got to be alert for other aircraft flying non-standard patterns, which include long straight-in finals. At this point, I rolled out on final, and you can see I probably rolled out a little bit early because I appear to be a little bit left of center. So I've put the airplane in a slight right bank to get myself aligned with the center line, if there was a center line. It appears as though I also might be a little bit low, so I'm going to hold off deploying any additional flaps until I'm closer to the runway. Now things are pretty well lined up, although I am still slightly left of center. The thing to notice here is that there are some trees right at the very end of the runway, so it doesn't make sense to try to put her down right at the end. The runway is plenty long, as you can see, and so you might as well leave yourself plenty of margin to clear those trees. Here's an image of my panel on short final. Actually, I'm just coming over the fence and just about ready to round out and flare. If you'll note, the airspeed is about 72 knots. VREF in a Cirrus is 77, minus 1 knot for every 100 pounds under gross. Given that there's only myself and a fairly petite lady in the back seat taking photos, and I'm at half tanks, 72 is just about the right airspeed. You'll notice from the attitude indicator that I got a slight nose-up attitude. That's maintaining that airspeed, and the power is set so that I've got a 500 foot a minute descent. Wings are level. And you can see the altimeter says I'm about 1,500 feet MSL, and what I'm using for an altimeter setting is that setting from a nearby towered airport. So, you know, it could be off 50, 60 feet, who knows. But at any rate, I'm just about ready to land. Okay, we're in the process of flaring. Throttle was reduced to idle during the round out, and at this point I'm just adding increasing amounts of back pressure to gradually ease the plane onto the runway. I may add just a touch of power to cushion that last little bit of descent, and just adding more and more back pressure to hold the nose off and hold the mains off as long as possible. At this point, the mains are only inches above the runway, and I'm continuing to add increasing amounts of back pressure to the yoke to hold the plane off the runway as long as possible and maintain a slight nose-high attitude. This is an illustration the pilot never gets to see. Of course, we're busy looking outside the window, fully engaged in the landing process. But if you take a look at the six-pack, you'll notice that my airspeed's down around stall. I'm pitched up 8 or 9 degrees or so. The altimeter setting is virtually indistinguishable from the previous reading, and the wings are level, and the VSI is showing 200 feet a minute. But you recall that the VSI lags actual by 4, 5, maybe even 6 seconds. So chances are my descent rate is much, much less than indicated. Okay, the last series of photographs showed the landing process from inside the cockpit. This set of photographs will show that same process from the ground observer's point of view. Here you can see the aircraft is lined up with the runway. The flaps, although you can't tell from this angle, are fully deployed, and I'm about to reduce the power to idle and just about to start the round out. Here you can see the aircraft has rounded out and is in the process of the landing flare. I'm gradually adding more and more back pressure to continue to reduce the descent rate and ease those wheels onto the ground. Keep flying the airplane. As the airplane moves closer and closer to the ground observer, you can see that the mains have moved closer and closer to the runway surface. I'm continuing to add increasing amounts of back pressure to the yoke, keeping the nose in a slight pitch-up attitude. Notice I said slight, not extreme. And I'm basically playing a little game with the yoke called Don't Let It Land. That is to say, continue to add yoke back pressure so that you don't climb, but try to arrest that descent as much as possible. Keep flying the airplane. As the aircraft moves nearly abeam the ground observer, you can see that the mains are only an inch or two above the runway surface, while that pitch-up attitude is doing a good job of holding the nose wheel off. At this point, patience is truly a virtue, and as I said earlier, keep flying the plane. Now, as the aircraft pulls abeam the ground observer, you can see that the mains have finally touched, looking at the slight trace of dirt behind the wheels. However, the nose wheel is still nicely off the runway surface, and what you can't see in this particular photo is that the yoke is full aft, giving me full up elevator. In this photo, the aircraft is just moved past my ground observer, and you can see that the full aft yoke is producing a full up elevator movement. You can also see my backseat passenger as she's busy taking photographs. Here you can see that the aircraft has moved well past the ground observer. I still have full up elevator, and that's still keeping the nose off the ground. That is something you really do want to pay attention to, if at all possible. I realize it's challenging depending on the aircraft that you're flying, but letting the nose come down prematurely while you still have quite a bit of speed really doesn't do anything except ensure job security for your mechanic. Well, now that we've landed at some nice isolated strip in the middle of nowhere and had a good time and enjoyed yourselves while on the ground, it's time to leave again. So, unfortunately, no one probably built an ASOS or an AWAS while we were sitting here on the ground under a pine tree, and I doubt that somebody has paved the runway. So we've got to figure out how to leave this delightful, small, unimproved strip. However, because of the pre-flight preparation we did prior to arriving here, we already have a good handle on the runway length. We certainly know what the surface irregularities look like, and we know the airport's altitude. In terms of wind, all we really need to do is make sure that we know which way it's blowing so we can choose the suitable runway. And when it comes to the altimeter setting, all you really have to do is adjust it so your altimeter reads the field elevation. Pretty straightforward. The next thing to be considered is the run-up. If you've just landed and are immediately back taxiing for takeoff, there's no need to do a run-up regardless of the type of surface you're on. If you happen to be on grass, and if the engine has been shut down for any serious length of time, then a run-up is in order. And because of grass, you can do a conventional stationary run-up without fear of pulling any debris up into the prop. On the other hand, if you're on a dirt or gravel runway, you need to be aware of the possibility of damaging the prop by virtue of pulling debris from the loose surface up into the leading edge of the prop. As a result, many people either do a low-power, very abbreviated run-up just to make sure that both mags are working, or they'll do the run-up on the roll. My personal preference is to do the run-up on the roll while I'm back taxiing, maintaining light brake pressure to avoid accelerating the aircraft to any great degree. On a truly soft runway, you're going to want to keep the aircraft moving while you're back taxiing to take advantage of the aircraft's momentum and to avoid having to use high power levels. So that translates into trying to not do any sharp turns and to avoiding any aggressive braking. This leads naturally into, well, when do I configure the airplane for takeoff? Normally, of course, this is done immediately after your run-up and before you take the runway for takeoff. And of course, now you're back taxiing on the runway. If you're very comfortable with the aircraft and you typically use a flow rather than a checklist for that final configuration, then go ahead and do that flow while you're back taxiing, assuming that the runway is doesn't require special attention or isn't unduly narrow or something like that. On the other hand, if you'd prefer to use a written checklist, then my suggestion anyway is that you complete your back taxi, turn around completely, come to a complete stop, and then go ahead and run your checklist, configure for takeoff, and then proceed. Once the aircraft is turned around and facing upwind and you're ready to take off, make sure the yoke is still full aft and add power gradually to begin your takeoff roll. Advance the throttle as the speed builds, and eventually, actually rather in a short time, the nose will begin to rise. That's because, of course, you've got full aft yoke. As the nose rises, relax the yoke back pressure slightly so that you don't over-rotate effectively. And as that nose comes up, be ready on the rudders, because now the only thing keeping the airplane going in a straight line is indeed the rudders. And remember that you've got P-factor that's going to want to turn the airplane to the left. Shortly, the airplane will actually leave the ground and be in ground effect. Is flying too slowly at this point to actually fly out of ground effect. So what you need to do is add forward pressure on the yoke and fly parallel to the runway while in ground effect. As the speed builds, you'll find you'll have to keep adding more and more forward pressure to not climb. Once you hit an appropriate airspeed, relax that forward pressure and allow the airplane to climb normally. About the time that you've reached an appropriate altitude and are safely away from the ground, retract your flaps and then climb at either best rate or best angle, whatever is appropriate. Now that we've reviewed the takeoff procedures, let's go ahead and look at a series of images that actually show this put into action. In this particular slide, you can see that I've obviously applied a fair amount of throttle. There's a lot of dust behind the airplane. What you can't see is that the yoke is full aft, and I have flaps at 50%, which is a conventional takeoff deployment, flap deployment for an SR-22. The nose has yet to leave the ground, and basically I'm on my takeoff roll with the speed accelerating. This next image is simply more of the same. The takeoff roll is continuing. My speed is accelerating. The nose, I haven't quite gotten enough elevator authority developed at this particular speed to raise the nose, but it'll come up fairly soon. At this point, the aircraft's airspeed during the ground roll has increased sufficiently so that I have elevator authority to raise the nose off the ground. And I'm modulating the yoke back pressure to make sure that I stay balanced on the mains and that I don't excessively raise the nose, and neither do I allow it to come back and touch the runway surface. Now that the nose has come off the ground, but my mains are still firmly on the runway surface, here's a quick shot of the panel. Admittedly, this is something that normal pilots wouldn't get to see because our attention is focused outside the airplane. Taking a look at the airspeed indicator, you'll see it's indicating something just slightly over 40 knots. In my aircraft, 40 knots is as low as you can possibly read, so basically it's just begun to indicate. Looking at the attitude indicator, you can see that I'm pitched up slightly, and if you look at the altimeter, you'll notice that it's sitting at about 1,250 feet. That's a little bit less than the 1,500 feet that when I landed, and the reason for that is simply that my altimeter setting was previously too high. Notice that the VSI is fundamentally reading 0. I'm not climbing yet, I'm just motoring along the ground. As the aircraft approaches the ground observer, you're going to get a better view of the balancing act that the pilot maintains during a soft field takeoff. Notice that the mains are still firmly on the runway, and the nose is approximately the same elevation above the runway as it was previously. That's due to the fact that I'm modulating the yoke back pressure while the aircraft's airspeed increases. Here's another shot of the panel as the aircraft is about to leave the surface. Of course, the pilot again doesn't get to see this because we're busy looking outside the aircraft, but now we have an opportunity to look at things at our leisure. Notice that the airspeed's increased and is approaching 55 knots, looks like right now around 52 or 53. Pitch up attitude is just about the same as it was in the last photo. Of course, the altitude hasn't changed because we haven't left the ground, and again the VSI is still reading 0. These next two slides continue to illustrate the balancing act that the pilot has to maintain during a soft field takeoff. Notice that in this slide, the nose remains in a relatively fixed position above the ground. And this slide clearly shows there's plenty of ground clearance between the tail tie-down ring on the cirrus and the runway itself. In this slide, I've finally developed enough airspeed for the airplane to actually take off and fly in ground effect. I'm applying forward pressure to keep the airplane in close proximity to the ground as the airplane accelerates. Once the aircraft leaves the ground and enters ground effect, you'll notice that it accelerates very rapidly due to the fact that you don't have the rolling friction of the surface itself. And you'll have to apply more and more forward pressure to the yoke to avoid climbing out of ground effect. Once you've accelerated to a suitable speed, which is probably only slightly above your normal rotation speed, you can relax that forward pressure and you'll see the aircraft now begins to climb. Now that the airplane is in the air and climbing, do what you normally do. Pitch for the standard pitch up, which in my aircraft is probably about 8 degrees or so. And given that you have a full throttle application, which you should, then you'll notice that the aircraft accelerates to its normal velocity and climb rate. As your airspeed continues to increase, you'll notice that the aircraft begins climbing quite quickly, or at least as quickly as it normally does. At one time or other, we've all been taught that aircraft performance is based on power, attitude, and configuration. Now that we're nicely away from the ground, as depicted in this particular slide, it's okay to adjust those parameters so that you can assume a typical climb. In my case, I would pitch for about 8 to 10 degrees, and I'd retract the flaps to 0. And that'll give me a VY climb of about 101, and I'll be climbing at full throttle all the way to cruise altitude. Operating from dirt runways can provide some cosmetic damage to the aircraft. In particular, it's tough on wheel pants. Here you see a photo of my nose wheel, and if you look extremely closely, you'll see chips in the paint on the forward part of the nose wheel caused by small pebbles being thrown backwards by the prop. And in this side view of the nose pant, you may notice a star-shaped crack in the paint just aft of the first set of screws. That's caused by a rock or a dirt clod being thrown up inside the wheel pant by the wheel itself, and that caused the gel coat on the outside of the wheel pant to crack. There was no structural damage done, but it is cosmetic and it is a nuisance. Operating from a grass strip has far fewer deleterious effects on the wheel pants. Basically, all you'll see is a little residue on the front nose wheel strut. A little bit of soap and water, this comes right off, and she looks as good as new. Once you're willing to venture away from towered airports with their conventional concrete or asphalt surfaces, you'll find your quotient for adventure rises considerably. These next two slides show Isla Contadora. It's a small island off about 50 nautical miles off the west coast of Panama. You'll see that basically the runway spans the island, starting on the water at one side, ending at the water on the other. There's a delightful little resort there, and you have an airplane, and that's all it takes. Of course, you don't have to fly as far south as Central America for adventure. You could choose to fly down the Baja coast and land at Mulegé in Baja Sur, California, which of course is actually in Mexico. There, Hotel Serenidad is served by a very nice dirt strip, complete with concrete run-up pads. Don't land on the run-up pad, land beyond it. You certainly don't have to leave the United States to have some incredible scenic adventures. One possibility is flying up to Monument Valley. They used to have a runway that was half dirt and half asphalt. Now it's been improved and the entire length is paved. And as you can tell from the scenery, it's just magnificent. Although we don't have very many grass strips in Arizona, in fact, we don't have any that I know of, other parts of the United States certainly do. These next two slides depict Ferndale, Montana. It's a delightful little grass strip just south of Glacier National Park and just west of the mountain ridge that defines the entire Flathead Lake Valley. Beautiful scenery. And as long as you're looking for grass strip adventures, you might consider landing at Spotted Bear. Spotted Bear is a Forest Service strip in northern Montana. It's just east of the Flathead Lake in that same mountain range that defines the Flathead Lake Valley. It's a beautiful little strip. These three photos were taken by a friend of mine, Tom Close, who landed there in his Cirrus SR-22.